Hi, this is Dina for Splitcoaststampers. In this tutorial, I'll show you how I make Starburst backgrounds. This is a fun way to use up scraps and really add some drama to a card. There are some tutorials that use measured pieces for these backgrounds, but I prefer to start with a pile of scraps that already exist in my stash, so I don't worry about this size too much. As long as the pieces are long enough to reach from one side of the card to the other, you're golden. Generally, they need to be about 5 to 7 inches long, but you can use a few shorter ones too once you get closer to your focal point. So these are all scraps from my stash, and I have one here with an odd edge, so I'm going to trim that off. You'll want to have rectangles to start with, so if you have odd scraps, just make sure that the edges are all squared up. Once I have all my scraps ready, I'm going to cut each piece in two from any corner to the opposite corner. We're just going to end up with triangular wedges. And you can cut from left to right or from right to left. It doesn't matter at this point. I'm going to split some of these wider pieces, and really you can use any width, but I like my pieces to be about 1 to 2 inches wide. If they're wider or narrower than that, it doesn't really matter. It actually just adds to the interest of the card. So that's up to you how wide your scraps are. I really prefer to make my Starburst backgrounds on a solid colored cardstock base and to let that solid color show through in between the wedges. I think that it really adds to the drama of the background, and it also breaks up some of the patterns that we're mixing together with all these different scraps of paper. So I started here with my first wedge to determine where my focal point will be. And for this style of background, you can choose any point along any side of the panel. That's completely up to you. I just usually, for some reason, go to the right side, but you can choose any point anywhere. From the first wedge, I just build out from that point with wedges on either side, and I leave a small space in between each wedge. It's maybe about a 1/16 of an inch. Just a few tips for building your background here while you're watching me work. I do try to keep wedges of the same color separated, so there's some variety across the panel. You know, you have at least 2 pieces of each color or pattern, so you can use them in the same order as you go, or you can alternate patterns and solid pieces, whatever looks balanced to you. On this card, I have a couple of pieces that are brighter and a couple that are darker, so I try to use one toward the top and one toward the bottom. Really though, however you put it together will be beautiful and it will be completely unique. And if it worries you, then you might want to lay out your pieces before you glue them down just to be sure that you're happy with the order. Also, you might have noticed that I'm not being really careful with the glue here, and I'm essentially gluing my project to the table, but I can get away with that since I'm working on a craft sheet. All that to say, I would recommend that you work on a craft sheet if you're using glue. Once you've filled up your panel, the next step is to trim off all the overhanging pieces from the edges of the card. And I'm just doing that with scissors, but you could use a paper trimmer to do this too. If you do use a trimmer, you might want to cut at least the first edge with scissors so you have a straight edge to go from. Actually, if your die cutting machine is wide enough, you could actually use a die to cut the panel as well. And here is how I use that panel on a card. These are stamps from Concord and Ninth from a set called Let's Chat. If you want the focal point of your Starburst to be at a point within your panel instead of on an edge, you'll start in the same way with a single wedge pointed at your focal point, and then you'll work your way around the panel, adding wedges with a space in between just like we did before. If you do leave a space in between, just be aware that your points at that focal point won't all meet in an exact center. And I don't usually worry about that. It's not a big deal because I almost always cover up that point with another panel or a die cut or stamped image or something. Now at this point, I need to apologize because I have created a problem for myself here. When you get down to the last empty space on your panel, you're going to need to cut a custom piece to fit it exactly, and I've actually made that hard on myself here by working into a corner. And while that's doable, it's not really the best place to show you how it's done, so I'm going to show you how to do it on a side first by the magic of Photoshop, and I'll try again with the next sample. So let's pretend that I ended on the side here instead. To determine the size of the final wedge, you need to measure the long side of the open space first, from the focal point to the edge of the card base, and that's going to be the length of the scrap you need. And then from that edge point, the point on the edge of the card, measure up at a 90-degree angle to the other side of the opening. And that measurement is going to be the width of the scrap you need. Then you'll cut a piece of cardstock that size and cut it across at an angle like we did with the other pieces, and just make sure that the right corner is on the proper side. I think I messed that up too, but since I had double-sided paper, I was able to flip it over and it worked out okay. But just bad all around. I'm so sorry. On a happy note though, here's my card, and if I hadn't told you that I messed up that little corner, you wouldn't have noticed. Again, these are stamps from Concord and Ninth, and this set is called Shine Brighter. In case you do end up needing a corner piece, here's how you work with that. The measurements are the same in concept. You just need to extend them to include the corner. And in this case, I had a short piece on the other side of the opening, so I had to extend that line out to determine the width. And hopefully that visual makes sense to you. I have one more sample, and with this one I just wanted to show you a shortcut for the adhesive if you don't want to use glue or you don't want to leave spaces between your wedges. This is label paper, so it's text weight paper and fully adhesive on one side, and that makes really quick and non-messy work of this type of background. I use this label paper to do herringbone backgrounds as well, and it makes them really easy. For this sample, I'm lining up the points at my focal point and also lining up the sides so there's no spaces in between. I think though if you wanted to leave spaces and rub in some micro fine glitter into the spaces instead, that should work with this method, and that would add some sparkle to your starburst. So again, I'm down to the final space on my card panel. So to determine the size of the final wedge, I'm going to measure the long edge of the open space from the focal point to the edge of the card base, and that's going to be the length of the scrap I need. And then from that edge point, I measure up at a 90-degree angle to the other side of the opening, and that is going to be the width of the scrap I need. I'm going to cut a scrap with those dimensions. And then I'll cut that scrap from corner to corner. And that fits perfectly into my open space. For this sample, I wanted a square card, so I used a Spellbinders die to trim up my panel, and then I added some die cut images from Concord and Ninth. Here are a couple more samples that I made when I was working out my instructions for the photo tutorial. I really like how these backgrounds work with smaller images by really drawing your focus in. I hope you'll give this technique a try, and I thank you so much for watching.